Hey, my friends. So today we're going to do something a little bit different, and I'm inviting you to come on a little journey with me. And I'm going to say some things that I hope are interesting and that are enlightening. And I'm asking you, if you have clicked on this video, you've gotten this far, to stay with me. And if I say anything that makes you feel a little resistance, just accept it, keep going, and stick with me. Probably the people who could most benefit from watching this video, maybe not the ones that are gonna... I'm gonna take my glasses off so that you can see my face. I just feel like that's more personal. Are not the ones who are gonna stick with it, but please, give it a go. So over the past few weeks, a couple folks have reached out to me and said, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you made a video talking about the world and all of the struggles that are going on, particularly in the United States, particularly related to race. And what I felt like was that nobody needed another white guy to come on and tell folks they already knew, things they already knew. And I've been trying instead to share resources and voices that are speaking from a more experienced and authentic place than I can. That said, I'm a loudmouth and a trainer by trade. And so what I thought I could contribute, because this is something that I've studied for a while, is sort of an offering, a gift to you of a little bit of bringing big topics down to size. This is something I try to do with tarot, right? I try to bring tarot down to earth. I try to make and dissect how to read into the micro so that your macro becomes more specific and clear, right? So I figured that as someone who has studied this, who's still got a long way to go, what I could offer to folks who are willing to accept it is to try to take the big concepts that are being talked about in the conversation about race in America right now, and to try to make them a little bit more specific and a little bit more concrete by giving you context and specificity. I'm going to do that by using something not related to tarot, but something that I feel like I have a little bit of credibility talking about because it's what one of my degrees are in, which is language, okay? So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to use language to demonstrate to you systems of racism and white supremacy. Now, I'm going to start by defining those two things, okay? Because I want you to understand that, you know, if you are reading any of the books that have been recommended, including White Fragility, including So You Want to Talk About Race, including How to Be an Anti-Racist, including Racism, or the Layla Saad book. I'll put the link below. I always get the title inverted. You will know this already, but let's just level set here. Folks, white folks in particular, when we hear racism, when we hear white supremacy, our hackles go up because we associate those concepts with the KKK and the Nazis, right? Those are part of those things. But what we need to do is start to understand those two concepts as something beyond that has nothing to do with our goodness or badness as human beings, just as things that are, right? So racism is a system of racist policies and procedures built into institutions that benefit white people and create obstacles for people of color. There's all kinds of other things that create obstacles for lots of folks. But that's just at a very granular level what we're talking about. White supremacy is the centering of whiteness and white comfort. People think of white supremacy as related to white supremacist organizations. That's different. White supremacy is an institutional centering of this, that I get to walk down the street unafraid. All right? So let's just understand those two things, and I'm going to come back to them. There's so much to unpack here. Like, even trying to talk about this one micro topic could go off in so many different variations. But what I want, again, to help you understand, if you stay with me, is how those two things impact so many things we don't even realize. Because we're protected from them as white people, all right? So, let me get to the point here. So what I want to do is I want to talk about language. I want to talk about English, American English in particular, okay? And what I want to do is use that to demonstrate how white supremacy and racism are built into aspects of life we don't even think about. Okay? So, here's some facts about the English language. First of all, it is a salad made up primarily of Latinate words, German words, and then anything it wanted to take from any language across the globe, usually as a result of colonialism. There is no governing body. There's no single governing source in the United States that dictates what is and is not American speech, American English. That's not the case in all countries across the world. In France, there is a governing body that says this is French and this is not French. They make the rules. That seems problematic, but we won't even go there. American English is an evolution. It is a thing that has evolved over hundreds and hundreds of years. And English itself has done the same. There is evidence, for example, that the word girl, as we know, like a little girl, a child, an infant, female, that word originally meant a male child. Like somehow over time, that word evolved to mean the opposite of what it meant. The phrase "that's a moot point," which we take to mean that's not worth talking about. The word moot actually does not mean that. It means debatable. So when someone says that's a moot point, it doesn't mean it's not worth talking about. It means that it's actually a point worth debating. But the word has evolved. Linguists call it now a skunked word because nobody knows what it actually means. Another example of that is nonplussed, right? Nonplussed means the exact opposite of what it sounds like it means and the way that most people use it. So it's kind of a skunked word because most people understand it to mean the opposite of what it does. So language evolves. It evolves through trends. It evolves through contact with other humans. It involves culture and entertainment and popularity. And the thing about English, unlike Latinate languages, is that the rules came after. So English is a very, very messy language. And anyone who has learned English coming from another language is kind of a hero to me because it is such a difficult language. The rules do not make sense. And over the years, well-meaning, one assumes, people, like Noah Webster, for example, attempted to standardize English and confuse things even more, which is why you can spell canceled with both two L's and one L, for example. It's why American English doesn't have the letter U in color the way that Canadian and British English does, for example, because Noah Webster attempted to simplify English. When we go to school in the United States, we learn something called Standard American Speech or Standard American English. There are different names for it. And those are the rules that have come over the course of American history. And these are the things like you don't end a sentence in a preposition, which is false, you can. Don't split an infinitive, which is false, you can. It teaches us the parts of speech. It teaches us what is and is not good grammar. And it teaches us how to write well, how to communicate well, right? That's the theory of what standard American speech and English education is meant to do. Now, I'm telling you this as someone who majored in English. This is something that I learned in school, what I'm about to share with you. So for those who are like, oh my God, but English, just stick with me, okay? Here's the thing about standard American English. The rules about standard American English were decided on by the people who ran institutions like colleges and universities, grammar schools, the people who are writing the textbooks, the people who are writing the guides and building the lesson plans for the entire history of the country. And we're talking again, sorry, my allergies are bad, about standard American speech. Those rules were all written, presumably, by white people. Because in the history of this country, white people had the power to write the textbooks, to write the guidebooks, to develop the lesson plans, etc. So, here's where folks are going to start getting defensive, right? This is where you lean into that defensiveness and you just stay with me. I don't know whether the intent of the designers of a standard American grammar had maliciousness at their heart, but I do know that they chose a version of English to standardize that is common to middle-class white people with a basic traditional American education, which people assume is going to be grammar school, high school, and then some college. Maybe not a complete college degree, but college to some point. When those of us who learn standard American English get out into the world, especially if you're like me and you're like a writer and a word nerd and you love language, we often become champions of good writing and good grammar. And that's great, right? Like, language is beautiful. I love language. I love English, as messy as it is. To me, it's an amazing language because it is such a hodgepodge of weirdness, and the rules don't make sense, and it just is so human in its flaws. So we go out into the world, and we approach the world and the correctness of language through this lens of standard American speech, because we were taught it and we had access to it. We will judge job candidates by it. We will judge talent by it. We will judge intelligence by it. We will judge potential by it, because it is a fairly standard barometer of education, of willingness to be part of the norm, to communicate clearly, etc. We don't even think about doing that. We look at a cover letter and we're hunting for typos. We're not even seeing what the person's saying. We go on Facebook and we correct people's grammar. God knows it couldn't have been a typo, right? We can't, as people like who are excited about language, in our enthusiasm, we often like jump to correct. You know, there are people out there, the term grammar Nazi drives me crazy, but we'll get to that. It's like, really? Grammar? Like, come on. Anyway. I grew up that way. I went to a Catholic parochial grammar school where I struggled for 8 years, 9 if you count kindergarten, to wrap my mind around standard American English. Went to high school, struggled through that, did pretty well in English. My dad is an editor, so he taught us to speak correctly. Went to college, dropped out, went back to college, majored in English language and writing. This is something I care deeply about. And in that program, I was forced to reckon with this. Standard American speech doesn't exist. And when you look at the American map, the United States map, what you actually see is that there are regional dialects, there are cultural dialects, and there are things called ethnolects, which are versions of American speech that are impacted by ethnic origin and community, etc. And so we have standard American speech that we all learn in school if we went to school. And then around the country, you know, and this is true of anywhere English is spoken, there are pockets of dialects. But in the United States, there's a specific American speech, standard or what linguists might call non-standard American speech, which is called Black Vernacular English. There are different names for that. That's the one that feels most appropriate. Sometimes it's called African American Vernacular English, but that assumes that all black people are African American, which is not the case. And that's something, you know, again, we can you can read about, because it's not my place to teach you about it, but it's out there. And then there's other names for it that are a little more controversial. Here's the thing. So, Black Vernacular English is considered non-standard speech by the institutions that teach American English. So there are school systems and school districts in the country that have accepted Black Vernacular English as a standard, legitimate form of English. But they're few and far between from what I can see. And the general attitude toward education and Black Vernacular English is that if you want to get ahead, you have to learn standard American English or standard American speech. There's a lot to say about all of this. We don't know, or I shouldn't even say we, because I'm not a historian and I'm not a linguist. Linguists don't really know how Black Vernacular English formed, because prior to basically the 50s and 60s, no one really cared to study it because it wasn't valued as legitimate. There was standard American English, and you learned that in school, and if you couldn't speak it, then you were assumed to be unintelligent, uneducated, unwilling to learn, etc. I should also point out that there's a class element to this, too. I'm speaking specifically about race, but this applies to all ethnolects in the United States and classes who, again, did not grow up in an environment of standard American speech. The assumptions about Black vernacular English are often biased. There is an assumption from even very well-educated people that Black vernacular English is messy, that it's wrong, that it's incorrect, and that it doesn't apply to the rules of grammar. What's true is that it doesn't apply to the rules of grammar that have been accepted as standard by the institutions that teach English in this country, most of whom are dramatically overrepresented by white English speakers who grew up speaking standard American English or learning it. Linguists do know and have shown that Black vernacular English has a whole system of consistent rules and grammar that is not messy and not uneducated and not non-standard. In its environment, in its world, it has grammar, it has rules, and they are consistent. And while, like, American English has dialects around the country, Black vernacular English varies around the country. The rules are surprisingly specific and consistent for something that most Americans who grew up learning standard American English think is messy and uneducated and wrong. So now we take a breath, right? That's a lot to internalize. In like 17 minutes, I've tried to sort of like tell you the history of American English, which is very difficult to do. Black vernacular English probably came from the reality that human traffickers selling other human beings into enslavement denied the enslaved people education and literacy. Education and literacy were crimes for enslaved people, and the human traffickers who bought and sold them wouldn't just deny the enslaved people education and literacy, they would actively attempt to jail or kill anyone caught attempting to teach a Black person English or literature or to read. So the language of enslaved people became a form of English that was developed over time. And one of the reasons why there's such a bias against it, I would wager, is that in popular culture, from movies like Gone with the Wind to Song of the South to even, the lyrics of Showboat, Old Man River, white people have attempted to bastardize it in thin, hollow, minstrel show-like caricatures of the folks who developed an entire language to communicate with each other out of whole cloth because they were denied access to education. So Black vernacular English is tied up in this legacy of it's like of American history that is very complicated and very messy and very gross. So here, just to recap, here are things we know. American English developed over the course of hundreds of years. The rules were codified after the development of English, because English doesn't make really any sense. And it was the people in power, the people who had the power to develop institutions, run institutions of education, schools, libraries, colleges, universities, who wrote the textbooks, adopted as standard what they knew to be standard American English. Today, as we have already talked about, this gets kind of discursive because I have notes, but it's like I keep thinking of other things. So the bias in America is that white English, what we call standard American speech, is to be preferred over what we view as non-standard speech, non-standard English, which includes Black Vernacular English, Creole, what they call Hawaiian Pidgin, and even communities within specific cities. Like there's New York English, for example. Standard American speech is taken to be, by the masses at large, the correct way. And if you are not doing that, if you are not speaking or writing that, you are non-standard. You are other. You're outside, and you're doing it wrong. Obviously, not every person of color speaks a vernacular English. Because, of course, the way that we grow up speaking has everything to do with who we grew up with, how and where we went to school, if we went to school. But the bias lies in the fact that anything that isn't standard American speech is wrong and uneducated, which is just patently false. It's just different. And it comes from a different part of the American experience. Institutions make the rules because they have the power. And by institutions now, I mean basically everything. So again, schools, universities, colleges, libraries, but also corporations and government agencies. Decisions are made for hiring and giving benefits and making assumptions about someone based on the way they talk, dress, act, write, and speak. And because standard American English is considered the correct default, if you don't use it, that means that you're less likely to get hired, to get benefits, to get the job, to be seen as intelligent, to be seen as educated. It erases the validity of a version of American English that just happened to not be the version that white people learned in school. This is kind of a microcosm of what we're talking about when we talk about racism and white supremacy. White supremacy is the centering of standard American speech, and the assumption that that is the only correct way to do it, because that is how white people talk. And to get even more specific, it's how educated white people talk, which essentially in this country means good white people. So that is the right way to do it. That is white supremacy. It's also class supremacy, but that's not what this video is about. Because anyone who does not use that version of English has institutional obstacles they face when they apply for a job, when they go to get a loan, when they get benefits, when they are talking to someone on the phone, when they're ordering pizza. It centers white norms as the correct way. And it's racist because anyone who does not speak that, who will probably, Black Vernacular English is called Black Vernacular English because it is specific to generally Black populations. Now, if you were a white person who grew up in a majority Black neighborhood, you probably have some elements of Black Vernacular English in your speech. So, again, it's these things aren't black and white, ironically. So what I'm getting at is white supremacy and racism are the default of standard American speech and its preference over any other variant of it. In this case, I'm talking about BVE, but anything. So the systems that hire people, that bring you into Harvard, that give unemployment benefits, that give loans, the folks that have power to provide opportunities are operating from a bias against non-standard, what we call non-standard English. That is an institutional bias. So hopefully you're still with me, because this is very complicated. But do you see what I mean? Like, the bias is against an assumption that any non-standard English says that you're uneducated, untalented, unmotivated, and it buys into hundreds of years of stereotypes. And the stereotypes that American has of, or that white America has of black Americans aren't accidents. You know, if you, again, it's hard to even take this and make it micro because it is so macro. They're not accidents. What we know from just a passing glance of American entertainment is that, for example, minstrel shows were designed to teach northern white people all of the stereotypes that still exist about enslaved people that we're still dealing with today. We know, because history tells us this, that once Reconstruction started to fizzle in the South and freed formerly enslaved people had to make a living, every obstacle was put in place to stop them from doing that. And they became sharecroppers and farmers, and white Americans used that against them. And so the climate in the South, for example, was ripe for growing watermelons. This is a very triggering thing, so I apologize in advance. Black Americans, formerly enslaved, now freed Black Americans, tried to make a living selling what they could. One of those things happened to be fairly lucrative, and that was watermelons. And white Americans, in an attempt to disenfranchise and stop them from making money, created racist stereotypical art depicting these minstrel show characters with watermelon, which is why that is such a fucked up racist stereotype today. So the stereotypes that we have about marginalized people in the United States didn't just evolve. They were placed deliberately in order to teach us racist ideas. That's a lot, right? Yes, it is. Okay, what we have to do is we have to look with clarity at the world we're talking about here. Okay, so to come back to language, another insidious part of language is partly that it does evolve, which is great. You know, I mean, if we were still talking like Shakespeare, I would be bored out of my mind. The institutions that we grow up in and that make the decisions prefer standard American speech. And they are biased against ethnolects. Mostly, or probably most prominently is a better way of saying it, Black Vernacular English, or BVE. The thing that happens, though, is as pop culture comes along and introduces us to things we hadn't heard before, we, white Americans, will hear something on a TV show or in a song. And what we do is we start to take things that sound cool and bring them into our vernacular, into standard American speech. So we start to adopt, some might say appropriate, things from other cultures that we find cool and fun. The word cool itself, by the way, is one of these examples. It is, if you have any passing glance or any passing relationship to the history of American entertainment, it is impossible to deny the impact of Black American artists, musicians, writers, film, un-American culture, and the impacts that they've had on the way we speak, the things we talk about, the things we adopt as what's trendy and cool. But when we adopt those non-standard slangs because we think they're cool, we're participating in a system that both demonizes what we view as non-standard English, and we're just taking what we want because it sounds fun, and we're normalizing it. So we get to use that language without facing any bias or consequence because we have taken it and brought it into the fold of standard American English. Whereas the people who developed that language, the people who came up with those trends, are still being treated and experiencing bias. As a gay person, I can tell you I see this most specifically in the gay community, in the way that we have kind of taken over what drag artists have made in their internal language. If you watch the documentary Paris is Burning, which has some problematic aspects to it for sure, but documents people who otherwise would not have been documented, the language, the way that they speak, the idiolect of the drag community, mostly Latinx and people of color in New York City in the 70s and 80s, is all what you see on Drag Race today, and all what now cis, straight, white people are bringing in. So, like, reading for filth, spilling the tea, slay queen, all of that came from Black and Latinx trans and drag artists in the New York City ball scene in the 80s, who faced immense discrimination and risks to their lives. I mean, many of the people in that documentary lived with AIDS, were murdered, so we today get to use that language like, yes, queen, without facing the consequences that the people who formulated and developed that faced bias against. And this leads to something called code switching. Code switching, just very loosely, is when someone who has some kind of, quote, non-standard speech or behavior has to adopt a normalized speech or behavior in order to be taken seriously or to fit in. And so code switching essentially means that someone who has been brought up or who grew up speaking Black vernacular English, for example, knows that when they go into a predominantly white environment or into a job interview or applies for a loan, they're going to have to switch into standard American English so that they get the respect that they are entitled to, and they're not seen as something other based on the biases of the institutions that we're talking about. So this is what I'm trying to do is kind of take one thing that we don't even really think about that much, that we go through our lives not thinking about language. We go to school, we have to read the Shakespeare, we have to diagram our sentences, and we hate it. And we come out and we write our cover letters and we go to our job interviews. And we never really think about how we're communicating because we've never really had to. So then there's this extra layer of pressure on folks who didn't grow up in speaking what we call non-standard English to essentially learn a new language. So you could make the argument that people who speak Black vernacular English are bilingual in a sense because they are forced to speak a white English in order to not be denied opportunities. That's a huge oversimplification, but that's what code switching is. So it puts additional pressure on people of color who grew up speaking non-standard. I'm putting non-standard in quotations every time because non-standard doesn't exist. So it's an additional bias, it's an additional obstacle, it's an additional thing that someone has to do in order to get the same opportunities that I would get walking in the door, because I don't have to speak a different version of language in order to be seen as educated. I had the privilege of being raised into the norm, which means I don't have to face the obstacle of code switching. So all right, so you take this one example, right? This one example of institutionalized bias, of institutionalized white supremacy and racism. That's one. And that's a lot to think about. It took me almost 40 minutes to even get close to making that make sense. And that's just language. So you add to that all of the other institutions, all of the other biases, all of the other normalizations and centering of white experience. And it's insidious because it impacts so many parts of life that we don't, as white people, have to think about. We don't have to think about how we're communicating. You know what I mean? It's like, there are so many things. So when someone says, like, white privilege, we assume, like, you're calling me out. Like, if someone says, Ben, you're showing your privilege, it's like, oh, I'm getting defensive because you called me privileged and I'm like a good white person. That's not the point. That's not what privilege is. Privilege means that I was given an easier journey because I grew up learning what the institutions of the United States view as standard speech, as appropriate, educated, correct language. And so I chose this because I have a degree in English and I've studied this thing. But this history and this bias impacts everything. You know what I mean? It's like, and it goes back to that intentional teaching of stereotypes and racisms in an attempt to protect human trafficking that was the foundation of the economy of a good portion of the United States. We're still living with those stereotypes. We're still living with the systems that have just transformed. So this is one example, but, like, you can look at how children of color are treated in schools and how they are viewed through a lens of criminality that white children aren't. The same goes for grown people of color driving in their cars. This is why we have to understand and do our homework and try to dismantle what we grew up learning as default, because until we do that, until we start to understand that even English is riddled with bias, even the language we speak every day is dripping with white supremacy and racism, until we start to face that reality, we're not doing anti-racist work. We're just saying, oh, I'm a good white person. I'm not racist. It's not about that. We have to pull back the onion and recognize that white supremacy and racism is built into almost every aspect of things we take for granted every day. And those of us who grew up white, or I guess white passing, don't have to face all of this because we've been protected from it. We have been considered the default from birth, you know? So, like, that's the thing. It's not racism and white supremacy are about whether you're a good person or a bad person. It's coming to terms with the fact that things we take for granted, from music to marketing, you know, to the way that we interact with someone who tells us we're being racist or we're exhibiting racist behavior, all of that comes from a place of white supremacy, of centering white comfort. If tomorrow some sea change happened and everything changed and Black vernacular English became the standard and we all had to learn it and use it in order to be considered educated and worthy of hiring, worthy of getting a loan, whatever, white people, we would, like, lose our shit because we would be forced to be uncomfortable. We would be forced to code switch, but we have no problem asking people of color to do that every single day. Do you know what I mean? So what I'm trying to get to in my very specific brain is that if you think about English as the seemingly innocuous thing, and you consider how impacted it is by bias and how the institutions use it to discriminate, something as simple as the English language, you start to see that, of course, it exists everywhere, because even the simplest things are impacted by it, you know? So I could probably go on and on and on. I don't know that it's worth it. I am willing to answer questions as long as they're sincere. I really don't want to fucking argue with anyone. I will say that, again, I'm not a historian and I'm not a linguist, and so I may have used phrases or language in attempting to make these points that may accidentally have been triggering or offensive to people of color if they watch this. Please, if you're willing, I'm happy to hear it. I apologize. These are difficult things to talk about because we don't have a shared language in order to talk about racism and bias, but we're learning. And I'm just going to encourage you again, you know what I mean? Read the books, do the homework, stop being defensive. Look at how racism permeates everything in American life. And I can only speak to American life because I've only lived in the United States. Everything is impacted by these things, and nothing will change until we're able to sort of put down our defenses and say, oh yeah, people who don't speak what is viewed as standard American English are discriminated against. That's fucked up. What do we do about it? Oh yeah, that was stolen from hip-hop, and the people, who made it aren't getting the credit for it because some white person did it. Whatever. So just if you stayed with me this long, thank you. I posted a lot of resources out there, but again, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, So You Want to Talk About Race by Giacomo Alu, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. There are many, many books out there and articles and videos. I posted a TED Talk earlier today from Baratunde Thurston. Go do those things, if nothing else, just let this dumbass white guy who's trying to at least give you a gift of an opportunity to let your defenses down and learn, take this as inspiration to go and do your homework, right? Because it's not the job of people of color to teach you. The resources are out there. They've done that work for you. It's out there. You can do it. You don't need, you don't need people to teach you. The lessons are there, okay? But hopefully this brought racism and white supremacy down to earth so that when we're talking about those things, you understand that it's not about the individual, it's about the culture we live in. It's about the institution, and it's about how it impacts everything, okay? So take care, be well, do your homework, and stay healthy.